Welcome back to D&D Module Monday, the show in which I pull my chair closer to my desk, but then also talk about a module, read a module first, and then talk about it for however long I see fit. So today's a little interesting, as you could probably tell from the thumbnail, but we're going to be talking about Dragon Magazine. Now you might be wondering why, or you might be wondering what the hell Dragon Magazine is. I am thrilled you asked. So Dragon Magazine was a magazine started by TSR back in the mid-70s, and it eventually came to have a sister magazine by the name of Dungeon. And the reason that I want to take the time today, this will probably be one of the shorter episodes of Module Monday, if being brutally honest. This will probably, I don't know, I could be setting myself up to make a fool, to look like a fool, but I would think this would probably only take 15 or 20 minutes. But the reason I want to talk about these is really for a few reasons. For one, so let me just back up what these magazines were. So these were D&D centric magazines that very often contained information and details and supplemental material for the games themselves. Now there were differences between Dragon and Dungeon. Dragon was monthly, I believe it was monthly, unless I'm mistaken, while as Dungeon was predominantly bi-monthly. They were different in the sense it wasn't just a way, well, it was a way for TSR to double up and have two magazines, but there were differences. So Dragon was more general. Dragon was something more of a general gaming magazine. As you can see, I have a more traditional, this is 117 print of Dragon here. And if you look, so here's a advertisement for Michael Moorcock's Hawkmoon, some books. Dragon was more general in the sense that it had a little bit of everything. It was much more of a traditional magazine in the sense that there are tons of advertisements for things that might not explicitly be for D&D. Here's something from the Game Designers Workshop, stuff like that. This was more of a nerd mag. Again, it was still D&D centric and marketed towards D&D players, but it was not solely D&D, right? And here's the contents, everything like that. So this was published in 87. Now, Dungeon was a little different in the sense that Dungeon was more actually for the Dungeon Master, as you could probably expect from the name. Dungeon had a ton of modules and whatnot, and Dragon would occasionally have a module. Actually, I'm probably going to do at some point issue number 100 of Dragon, which I have, has a full-length module in it. Also part of the reason why I wanted to make a video talking about Dragon, because it would probably be weird if I said, hey, look at this module in a magazine one day, without explaining what the magazine actually was. But, so Dungeon, which again, I don't really have much Dungeon, because ironically, for what the purpose of this show is, I tend to think of things more as a player. So Dragon is typically more for the gamer, whereas Dungeon was more strictly for the Dungeon Master. But Dungeon would have things like modules, maps, stuff like that. Things that you could use to flesh out your own D&D game. And Dragon had much the same, but in a different way, and in a way that related more to the players. And I'll show you what that means. That's part of the reason why I picked this best of. One, because this dragon on the front of it is just really cool looking, but also because it does a pretty good job of showing how this was clearly meant, how a lot of this stuff was clearly meant for the players. But Dragon and Dungeon were both very, very successful. If you're like me and you're far too young to have read them when they originally released, this was kind of, I mean, everyone I'm sure has their own sort of regional thing, but for me it was like when I was a young man cementing my nerd status, I read a lot of Game Informer. I don't know if anyone else, I'm sure other people read Game Informer and whatnot, or whatever, maybe if you're in a different country or whatever was more local to you. I didn't read much Nintendo stuff. I know a lot of people have memories of reading Nintendo magazines. I wasn't a big Nintendo gamer. Sorry to say. Anyway, so really these magazines were both very popular, and they were kind of, so think Game Informer or something of that ilk for D&D. And I believe, I don't know if they're so. I want to say it was back in the mid 2000s where both of these magazines were actually moved to online only. I don't know if they're still running. Probably should have looked that up before I did this episode, started recording, but I don't. I almost want to say they're not. I'm almost certain Dungeon isn't. Dragon might still be. There might be some form of Dragon that's still out there online in some form, but I think Dungeon's dead. I'm fairly certain that's what it is. Anyway, so as for what is actually what you could find in Dragon magazine. Now, the reason I wanted to do this best of is because this was a very particular. So they released a couple of these back in the 80s, which were basically compilations of some of the best articles that had ever been featured in Dragon. And the reason I wanted to pick this one, Volume 3, is because it does a great job of showing how grassroots Dungeons and Dragons was at one point. It's very easy nowadays, right, to think about D&D in the sense of this very sort of polished, refined thing. And it is, as you would expect from, decades upon decades of work having been put into it. But back in these days, in the 70s and 80s, people were still largely coming up with this on the fly, to the point that they thought it necessary to actually basically educate the player base on how to play races outside of humans. So that is what this first section, this is separated into 4 different sections. And that is what this first section, finishing the races, is really all about. What it does is that it gives you, as you can see, it should be 5 different descriptions for how to play the other races. Because back in these days, nowadays your race, I don't want to say it's superficial, but your race does not really define your character. Back in the early days of D&D, it kind of did. Whatever your race was, you were kind of expected to act in a very certain way in regards to that race. It's not totally dissimilar from what I talked about in the Rogues Gallery episode, as your class sort of defined how your character was supposed to be. In a lot of ways, your race defined how your character was supposed to be. And what these articles did in this first section was point out how these races act and what's expected of them. Down to where they live, how their societies are built, whether or not they have things like government and whatnot. Also that you could understand if I'm going to play a dwarven character or an elven character or a halfling character or whatever, this is how they should be played. I think this is very interesting in the sense that, again, D&D used to be much more rigid, but it was also at a point where this needed to be defined. I don't think nowadays anyone would say, oh, I need to be told how to play a certain race. I don't think, because again, race is not nearly so important nowadays. Race is more so just a way to change your stats a little bit and get different stats. They also included various gods for each race, which sort of shows how different the gods and deity systems within D&D used to be. They just outright make reference to, say, like Celtic gods. They make reference to an Egyptian god at one point. And I say that not as in like... I say that not in the sense that it's related to those figures, but it's more so just... It's like, no, it is that god. Like they would just pull gods from existing real-world mythologies and put them in D&D. That's not really something they do anymore. They haven't done that really since the Forgotten Realms became well-known. But they would give you gods and each of their abilities and stats and whatnot and what they stood for and who would be likely to follow them, again, so that you could apply that to your character. This is all very, very, if you think about the time this was done in the late 70s, early 80s, this is all very, very, very Tolkien-inspired, to the point that the author of these articles, by the name of Roger Moore, cites like Tolkien works. At the end, you can see it here. He cites Tolkien-inspired works. You could probably see it in that final paragraph on multiple occasions in each of these races, particularly... and I meant to point out... oh, no, not yet. But well, this is where I'm going. Particularly And it has nice artwork, and this was all included in the magazines to begin with. The artwork is very good. But one of the things they did point out, like when I talk about that Tolkien influence, the halfling point of view, might as well just, I mean, they basically live in the Shire. They have hairy feet. These are hobbits. Halflings are not nearly so. I mean, look at this picture. Look at this picture. That's a hobbit in a Shire home. I mean, come on. And again, that's not nearly so. It's not nearly so blatant nowadays. The races have things about them that stand out a bit more. One of the things I'll find interesting that people that have played the games, certain things from here did stick around. Arverine, unless I'm going insane, Arverine is who Mazzy in Baldur's Gate 2 follows. So certain things did stick around and were kept. But this was, again, almost like showing you how this stuff was being built, down to the fact that it was believed that people needed to be told how to play it. Which, not what you would think of today, but kind of cool if you really think about it. And I imagine if you were a gamer at this point playing D&D in these days, you would be very appreciative of this, because if you didn't know how to play a dwarf or an elf, or what the backstory and backgrounds of those races were within the world at that point of D&D, which was largely Greyhawk, you would probably be very appreciative of this. And this is, again, what Dragon did, is that it supplied information that was to be used in the game. This stuff was written specifically to be used in your game, whether it was for character creation or even combat. We'll see more of that in a minute. But it was all very, very much intended to be used in the game. It was really supplemental material. You were paying, you can see here on the front of this one, 117, $350, which granted $350 is not a whole lot now. It was probably a little bit more in I think this one said it was 87. So everything in here, assuming obviously you agreed with it with your DM, you could use, like this article here. This is Roughing It. So these are stat lines and stat blocks for that someone, Thomas M. Kane, he came up with a system for wilderness survival and what you might need at any given time. And here's something for, like, you could use all this if you were a DM or if you were a player. You could bring it to the DM and say, this might be cool. Chance of discovering water, all of this stuff. And they have dice rolls. When you have undersea, so here's an undersea animals table. All of this stuff was meant to be used in your game. And that is shown as well in the next section that's in this Best Of magazine, which is Breathing Life into Dragons. So, well, really the next two sections. So what they first did with dragons at one point were actually not that great. They were basically big treasure hoards that you could go raid for money. And this section seeks to make them stronger. What's most interesting about this is this, as was in issue 37 on May 1980, this is the first instance of neutral dragons being found. Dragons predominantly were just good or evil, and then it was Arthur Collins who decided, you know what? They actually called them gem dragons, because as neutral dragons, basically the only thing they care about is money. But this was the first appearance of neutral dragons. Neutral dragons are obviously very much and plainly a thing in D&D. So something that originated in this Dragon magazine obviously later became a mainstay within the world of D&D. And, crystal dragons, topaz dragons, emerald dragons, sapphire dragons. They talk about fairy dragons at one point. They talk about hatching a dragon. This was a thing that D&D was very obsessed with back in the 80s. There was always something you could see about how to hatch your own dragon. I guess, I don't know why, I guess they thought it would be a really fun thing to do, but it's really only something that one character gets to do, because it's always based around whoever the baby dragon after hatching first sees becomes effectively their mother and is then saddled with a dragon, and the party doesn't get to do a whole lot. I don't know why. This is a total weird tangent, but I don't know why 80s D&D was so obsessed with dragon hatching. But here's this from Gregory Rin, I guess, is new damage tables and attack types so that dragons are better suited to actually be a tough fight. This obviously led to dragons being much closer to what they are today, which is a very, very difficult multiple attacks around, breath weapons, absolutely putting you on your ass that we are accustomed to. These magazines, Dragon Magazine, was very much played a role in developing the game of D&D as we know it. Almost as much as the rule books, because in between the rule books, you read Dragon and you said, I like that, I don't like that, and you added what you wanted to your game. And like I said, a lot of this is now commonplace, and this obviously was what made these magazines very, very valuable to any young D&D player, or just any D&D player in general, who was always looking for inspiration and new things that they might want to put in their game. Here's the fairy dragon, but just stuff like this and what they can do, it's all very, very valuable and interesting to see how this stuff actually built the game we have come to love. Here's something about making dragon armor, which is something that has now been done God knows how many times. And then even playing with class. So as I talked about in the Rogues Gallery, certain classes were not as developed as others. And one of them, this thief one is interesting. It gives you some different things you can do with the thief. This is basically just like a thief rework. It's still fundamentally the thief. But anyway, like, when I talked about in Rogues Gallery in the last episode, when I said you weren't really supposed to play druids, well, Tim Lasco, this writer, in April of 81, realized that and did a huge write-up about what weapons druids could use, how their spells work, how they were expected to be played, how they fit into a party, particularly in the way that they knew the wilderness. This was all super fleshed out and would become much closer to what we know as the druid today. Such as, they could use blowguns, they could use scythes, they had spells, specific spells like predict weather and shillelagh, warp wood, call lightning. All these things are, now we see them as we're like, that's just very general. But these were all had to be done, and they originated in these magazines. Such as this one from Roger Moore, who sort of redefined playing a paladin, which was where, like, basically what he's saying in this article is, like, you don't have to be super stuffy to be a paladin. You do have to be good, and you have to be about honor and whatnot, but you don't have to be a stick in the mud. So that's, there's that. This one, remember when I said monks were really difficult to play? That is what this article tackles. This article speaks explicitly about how monks are very difficult to play because of how hard they are to level, how quickly they can find themselves dead, stuff like that, and goes on a huge, there's ability tables. I don't know what this writing is. I think this was my father's. I think this is his writing. I don't know what he was doing here with the monk classes, but he was obviously, he was cooking. I don't know what the hell he was cooking, but he was cooking something. But it detailed how monks should level, whether or not the alignment of monks, what they can be, how they can use their abilities. All of this stuff was meant and tested for the game. And you only got it if you got these magazines until the next rulebook came out. Here's something for the bard. Remember when I said bards were a prestige class? This makes bards a more proper class that can be played on their own. They still have really high stat values, as you could see here. I understand the text in this edition is small. I do apologize on that front. But here's experience tables and spells that they can learn. They could still learn druid spells in this version of the bard, but this was the start of the bard becoming a bit more of what you could see here in the level titles. Troubadour, minstrel, skald, stuff like that. They were becoming much more closer to what we know as bards today, and this all sort of detailed that, and a lot of work went into this stuff. Here is an article from Gary Gygax, which was the introduction to cantrips. And it's funny, I just want to point this out. So cantrips nowadays, we all know what cantrips are. Cantrips are basically just not great spells that you can use for free. Cantrips in early D&D were completely useless. I'm not kidding. All due respect to Gary Gygax, because they put it all in this. It's literally pages upon pages of these different cantrips, right? And most of them are useless. Like sour. When this cantrip is used, the caster causes the subject food or drink to take on a sour taste. Wow, I want to take up a spell slot for that one, and these did take spell slots. Okay. Belch. When this cantrip is cast, the subject will involuntarily belch. Bee. When this cantrip is used, the caster summons a honeybee from someplace. Yeah, listen, Mr. Gygax, great. These were all useless. The illusionist ones could be kind of, sort of, useful, because they could make, like, lights and stuff. But, again, these were all pretty useless. But here's some rules for spellbooks, again, also by Mr. Gygax, that brought out the value, what you could write into spellbooks, how much, and whatnot. And this was all, so as he says here, and just to prove how intended this stuff was to be played in the game, I'll read this section. All information regarding spellbooks in AD&D gaming is currently inferred. This was not, gentle reader, by design. Simply put, I overlooked it in the morass of getting 3 volumes put together. In order to rectify that oversight, the following rules are offered. When the AD&D expansion volume is completed, please don't ask me when, the same rules will be included therein, although possibly with some minor changes. So he's writing, this was basically what he was writing for an upcoming D&D book that he then put in Dragon. If you needed any more proof that this stuff was supposed to be used in your game, even in the intro to this section, it says, from when they compiled it, they say something about how yes, as is almost always the case with the magazine's offerings, these articles, with the exception of Mr. Gygax's words, are suggestions only. So they were like, yeah, this is going to be in your later rulebooks. Whoa! And then finally, rounding out, they made some new challenges, stuff that you could put your players against. This was more DM-minded. So they had the winged folk here, who could be fought, and they give you strength and treasure and strength values and all that, whatnot, because obviously you wouldn't be able to do much fighting if they didn't have all that. And these were more specifically supposed to be NPCs, but they could be. These were supposed to be NPCs. They could be player characters. Like this one, the Alchemist, which is a class that just never really took hold. This is a subclass of magic user, but they don't really fight. If anything, the Alchemist kind of was, in reading through this, a very, very like early form of the Artificer, actually, wherein like they build things and are supposed to use that, but they weren't really specifically fighters. They actually got their experience from creating things as opposed to killing monsters. It never really stuck. So this one was more player-based, but these were supposed to be like more so to have like a henchman that's an alchemist, so that you, or just an NPC that you're aligned with, so that they could make you stuff. But it, again, these tables, they could be used for players, the experience tables and what their poisons do. But these were all meant to flesh out your world. And then finally, I think the last one, an alchemist did get some spells. They could adopt some magic user spells eventually, but they were cast at much lower levels. And then finally finishing up the archer. We all know what the archer is. This archer is actually kind of similar to the one that shows up in the Baldur's Gate games, or the Infinity Engine games, which is neat. Not bad. They're really strong by the looks of it. This is probably the example of something that, for as much as this stuff was playtested, it would sometimes be a little out of whack. This archer, just in my opinion, based on these damage numbers, I mean, bonus to hit at range given, I mean, they're really high bonuses, even from really low levels. So this was probably a little strong, if I had to guess. But again, gives you tables, gives you ranges, stuff like that, all so that you could use it in your game. And that is why I wanted to talk about Dragon today. I had 25 minutes, not quite 20. Not quite 20. Was because these were addendums and almost like mini unearthed arcanas for players to use and to use in their games. And quite frankly, would frequently have different adventures and instances of what could be done. And Dragon as a whole, and Dungeon, are very, very important to the history of D&D. They helped, there's no two ways about it, they helped build D&D into what it is today. Both in the way that they gave TSR some money, and also in the fact that they were literally sourcing and housing articles that would later become mainstays within the game that we know and love. And for that reason, like I said, I think Dragon's still around. For that reason, I'll always love even just flipping through these sometimes. Obviously, like any magazine, you don't have to read them in their entirety, but they're so... It's like, with this third volume, again, the neutral dragons, the druid, the bard, even the monk in certain respect, the races themselves, so they're not as important. Seeing how that stuff developed, to me, is just awesome. And I think it was important enough to talk about so that in the future, if I decide to look at something from Dragon, you're not really confused as to what Dragon and Dungeon were. That was really the purpose of this episode, to sort of show what sort of stuff was in these editions, to give you a better idea of what these magazines were and what they did for the game, so that in the future, like I have Dragon magazine number 100, has a full-length module in it. I'm sure we'll get to it at some point, and now we know what to expect and what these magazines were like. So this was just cool for me. Like I said, I know this is not technically a module, so if you made it this far, go out and, like I said, you can read the online version of Dragon, and go out and buy yourself a few copies if you can. This stuff is just so... There's not a lot of things that I'm proud to have in my collection, in my bookshelf. These magazines are definitely some of them.